It's hard to say when the first fortifications appeared, but humans learned to protect settlements from the surrounding hostile world long before they built full-fledged cities. Walls and moats emerged well before the spread of black metallurgy and evolved separately over thousands of years. For a long time, there were no effective means to combat fortifications, and looking ahead, such tools would only emerge in the developed Middle Ages. However, in ancient times, a number of quite formidable-looking tension and torsion machines came into existence. In simpler terms, the first machines were based on the bow, an elastic element, while the second type relied on the elasticity of twisted ropes. Despite being classified as siege engines, the main purpose of these complex devices was not to break down walls, but to launch projectiles over the fortifications. In fact, even in the Middle Ages, the primary function of most catapults could be reduced to causing some damage to the interior of the fortifications and creating a psychological effect on the enemy. Around the 5th century BCE, in what is now China, they decided to combine a sling, a long pole, and a counterweight. This resulted in a quite interesting machine operating on the principle of gravity. In essence, it was much simpler and arguably more primitive than the creations of Greek and Roman craftsmen. However, this primitiveness actually became one of its advantages. The second advantage was the potential for development of this technology. The mass of the projectile and the range depended on the length of the lever arm and the weight of the counterweight. In other words, the weapon wasn't as limited in terms of increasing power as those that relied on the elasticity of wooden arms or ropes. The Chinese likely borrowed this idea from nomads who either brought or, more probably, gathered makeshift catapults from materials found near the walls of Byzantium. This happened in the 5th to 6th century, during the early Middle Ages. The device was unable to inflict any serious damage on the fortifications, but the Byzantines appreciated its design, and from there it began to spread across Europe. However, according to another version, the machine was independently invented by the Greeks. What would later be known as a trebuchet or porca appears, at first glance, to be a very simple structure consisting of a frame with an axle and a lever arm fixed to it. The lever arm is positioned relative to the axle in a ratio of 1:5 or 1:6. A sling is attached to one end of the arm, while a counterweight is attached to the other. The counterweight can be secured rigidly or connected through a movable joint. It is raised to a certain height manually or using special mechanisms, and then released. The energy transfers into the movement of the arm, which accelerates the sling and ultimately sends the projectile toward the target. In reality, seeing the potential of this design isn't as easy as it might seem at first glance. If you take the time to build, for example, a trebuchet with a 4-meter arm and a counterweight of around 100 kilograms, this structure will take up a considerable portion of your yard. However, when you begin testing it, you'll find that the maximum it can achieve is to toss a construction brick about 50 steps, or even less. So essentially, you end up with a siege machine that's more suited for destroying a neighbor's fence than for breaching fortifications. In fact, early trebuchets were more of a nuisance for those under siege than a real threat. At the same time, building one was relatively easy with the right skills, but everything changed by the start of the classic Middle Ages. During this time, castles and fortresses became extraordinarily widespread, and something had to be done about it. By the way, a fortress is generally a military structure, a series of buildings surrounded by walls. A castle is a relatively small, unified structure, essentially a well-fortified house where a feudal lord resides. While most people envision fortresses and castles as having towering walls reaching to the sky, in many cases, those walls were less than 6 meters high. As strange as it may sound, the most majestic castles with high walls were typically built at the twilight of the Middle Ages, when the role of such fortifications was not as significant as it had been earlier. The means capable of destroying walls became enormous trebuchets. In some articles, you often hear the phrase that a knight is like a tank or a fighter jet of the Middle Ages. If we draw such analogies, a trebuchet can be compared to an aircraft carrier, not in terms of usage, but in size and cost. For its time, these were incredible machines. The central arm could reach a length of 12 meters and was made from 2 large beams bound with steel rings. The sling was woven from ropes. According to surviving notes from Villars-de-Ancourt, the box for the counterweight had a volume of around 30 cubic meters and could easily weigh 10 tons or more. Meanwhile, the total weight of the assembled structure could reach up to 20 tons. There are reports that a cast lead counterweight performed best. However, it's important to understand that since a significant part of siege engines was made of wood, and they weren't produced in large quantities, we can only judge trebuchets based on engravings, written sources, and the few surviving elements. Clearly, there was no talk of building such trebuchets right under the enemy's walls. Based on modern experiments in constructing a large trebuchet, a team of 10 craftsmen would take about a month to build one. Such machines were stored in a special warehouse. The siege engine was transported in disassembled form, and assembling it took about 3 to 4 days, with an average crew of around 15 people to operate it. Transporting several tons of materials, especially the cast counterweights with horses, was quite the logistical challenge. But that kind of mass was a tough necessity. The weapon's capabilities were calculated by the British company Artifacts. However, the first real tests showed that the company hadn't taken into account the friction of the beam against the axis, or the energy loss within the structure's components. With these adjustments, a machine with an 8-ton counterweight could hurl a 100-kilogram projectile about 200 meters. A 400-kilogram projectile would only fly a few dozen meters, while a 40-kilogram one could reach up to 300 meters. A 6-ton counterweight could launch a 100-kilogram projectile around 140 to 150 meters, and a 4-ton counterweight could manage only 100 to 110 meters. By the way, real tests of a similar machine with a 6-ton counterweight and a 12-meter arm were conducted in Scotland. In general, for most large trebuchets, the weight of the projectile that could be launched a decent distance was between 50 and 200 kilograms. It's important to understand that stone is a pretty dense material. A 6 kilogram granite block, ag kaka, oldalai chak harmansut centimeter. In 1 cubic meter of stone, depending on the type, there are between 2 and 3 tons. So while the projectiles were heavy, they weren't necessarily large. Massive flying boulders are a fantasy. Also remember that the speed of such a projectile was relatively low. There was no dreaming of breaking through a fortress wall in one throw. To create a breach, dozens of hits in the same spot were needed, and besides luck, because accuracy varied, the projectiles had to be of uniform weight and shape. In reality, the age of trebuchets as siege weapons was rather short, lasting from the 12th to the late 13th century. By the 14th century, more powerful fortifications appeared, against which siege machines became increasingly ineffective. Further increases in the size of trebuchets were impractical, and likely technically impossible. It's worth noting that the beam, axis, and sling endured tremendous strain, and would occasionally break. Although even in the 14th century these machines were still used, as before, to destroy internal buildings. Sometimes, trebuchets were even used to send a captured messenger or spy back to the castle, or return pieces of the defenders. But cannons eventually spelled the end for trebuchets. A 15th century mortar, weighing just 1.5 tons, about 10 times less than a siege machine, could fire a 130-kilogram cannonball up to 200 meters, and the initial velocity of the cannonball was higher. Some monstrous versions could even launch half-ton projectiles over distances of 500 to 600 meters. However, there's one siege machine incident that had a profound impact on all of Europe's history, and dare I say, led to a real catastrophe. The early 14th century was marked by droughts and other calamities, causing rodents to move closer to human settlements. And in Asia, the plague broke out. It turns out that nomadic peoples could spread not just technology from east to west, but also diseases. Interestingly, the nomads themselves, due to their more isolated lifestyle and less contact with rodents, were less affected by the plague than settled peoples. We have records from the medieval writer Gabriele de Mussi, who described a conflict between the Genoese and the Golden Horde in Crimea. In case you didn't know, the Genoese Republic had several possessions on the Crimean Peninsula. In 1346, the Golden Horde's Khan Janibeg laid siege to the Genoese fortress of Kaffa, located in what is now Feodosia. During the siege, Janibeg used catapults to throw over the walls either the bodies of plague victims or parts of them. The siege didn't succeed, and the Khan retreated, allowing the Genoese to continue their trade. The incubation period for the plague is up to 12 days, and it can be spread not only by humans, but also by ship rats. From Crimea, the disease began moving west. Over the next 7 years, this would result in the death of 30 to 60% of Europe's population. So, in essence, one or several shots from a siege machine, probably not a complicated catapult, but rather a simpler and more practical trebuchet, ended up killing more people than an atomic bomb could. Then again, this is just one theory based on a single written source and the study of the disease's spread. The last known use of a trebuchet was in 1521. That's when, due to a shortage of gunpowder, Cortés decided to showcase European engineering to the Aztecs. His men built a siege engine that launched a stone straight up into the air and promptly self-destructed. Although there are also accounts of a rather large trebuchet with a 4-ton counterweight being built under Napoleon, likely for fun. In general, most siege machines, despite their intimidating appearance, weren't a decisive factor in the capture of serious fortifications. However, they could certainly make life difficult for the defenders.